Okay. Oops. Hi, fifth graders. Starting to get the hang of this. So we are going to read another few chapters in My Side of the Mountain. And the last time we read, Sam, who's the main character, he explained how he got to be running away to the Catskill Mountains to find his grandfather's land, and then he told us about some of the things that worked for him and some of the things that didn't work for him, as far as living off the land and using the plants and animals in his environment, in the ecosystem of the Catskill Mountains, the forest there, to survive. So I asked you guys for your assignment yesterday to name some of the plants and animals that he referred to in the book, if you remembered them. And you guys did some, name some things. Some of the things that I noticed, animals that he referred to were deer, which also he referred to as venison, that's like the deer meat. He talked about several fish like catfish and trout, turtles, squirrels, a weasel, who he calls the Baron, a falcon, who's his pet, woodpeckers, juncos, chickadees, nuthatches, these are all birds, worms, grubs, whippoorwill, which I have never even heard of that bird, so I'm going to look that one up, and then catfish. So those are all some animals, and I think I'm going to put some links on Schoology for some of those animals so you guys can kind of check them out and learn about them, as well as about the Catskill Mountains. And then he also talked about some plants, like several types of trees, so aspen, hemlock, beech trees, birch trees, and then he referred to acorns and walnuts and nuts and berries and bulbs and grass. He made jam out of blueberries. He talked about the ferns and the moss that were down by the stream where he was fishing. So lots of different plants and animals that he is, that are in his environment, that he's in the ecosystem that he's in. So we're gonna read 3 more chapters today, and we ended up on page 24 last time. So we're gonna start with I find many useful plants, and we are actually going to read the next 3 chapters. So I'm going to talk a little bit as I'm reading today, and then you guys will have a discussion question on Schoology again. Soon we will be doing some things from the Ecosystem Restoration Unit from our Amplify Science. And the other reason I really wanted to read this book and talk a little bit about things like this is because you guys missed Islandwood, which really stinks, but and this is definitely not a substitute for that experience or anything, but I'm really sad that I didn't get to experience that with you guys, because biology and environmental science are like my 2 favorite fields of science, and this makes me happy, so I'm hoping it makes you happy too. Okay, so this chapter is called In Which I Find Many Useful Plants. The following morning I stood up, stretched, and looked about me. Birds were dripping from the trees, little birds singing and flying and pouring over the limbs. This must be the warbler migration, I said, another bird. And I laughed because there were so many birds. I had never seen so many. My big voice rolled through the woods, and their little voices seemed to rise and answer me. They were eating. 3 or 4 in a maple tree near me were darting along the limbs, pecking and snatching at something delicious on the trees. I wondered if there was anything there for a hungry boy. I pulled a limb down, and all I saw were leaves, twigs, and flowers. I ate a flower. It was not very good. One manual I had read said to watch what the birds and animals were eating in order to learn what was edible and non-edible in the forest. Pretty smart. If the animal life can eat it, it is safe for humans. The book did suggest that a raccoon had tastes more nearly like ours, so there was definitely raccoons out by him. Certainly the birds were no example. Then I wondered if they were not eating something I couldn't see, tiny insects perhaps. Well, anyway, whatever it was, I decided to fish. I took my line and hook and walked down to the stream. I lay on a log and dangled my line in the bright water. The fish were not biting. That made me hungrier. My stomach pinched. You know, it really does hurt to be terribly hungry. A stream is supposed to be full of food. It is the easiest place to get a lot of food in a hurry. I needed something in a hurry, but what? I looked through the clear water and saw the tracks of mussels in the mud. I ran along the log back to shore, took off my clothes, and plunged into that icy water. I collected almost a peck of mussels in a very little time and began tying them in my sweater to carry them back to camp. So mussels are another type of animal that are in his environment, and I guess that a bunch of them, you know, mussels are they're similar to clams, like have like the animal inside of a shell, and I guess a bunch of them are called a peck. I didn't know that before. But I don't have to carry them anywhere, I said to myself. I have my fire in my pocket. I don't need a table. I can sit right here by the stream and eat. And so I did. I wrapped the mussels in leaves and sort of steamed them in coals. They are not quite as good as clams, a little stronger, I would say. But by the time I had eaten 3, I had forgotten what clams tasted like and knew only how delicious freshwater mussels were. I actually got full. I wandered back to great-grandfather's farm and began to explore. Most of the acreage was maple and beech. Also, there's maple trees too. Some pine, dogwoods, ash. Ash is a kind of tree. Dogwood's a kind of tree. Pine trees. And here and there, a glorious hickory tree. I made a sketch of the farm on my road map and put X's where the hickories were. They were gold trees to me. I would have hickory nuts in the fall. I could also make salt from hickory limbs. I cut off one and chopped it into bits and scraps. I stuck them in my sweater. The land was up and down, and I wondered how great-grandfather ever cut it and plowed it. There was one stream running through it, which I was glad to see, for it meant I did not have to go all the way down the mountain to the big creek for fish and water. Around noon, I came upon what I was sure was the old foundation of the house. Miss Turner was right. It was ruins, a few stones in a square, a slight depression for the basement, and trees growing right up through what had once been the living room. I wandered around to see what was left of the old Gribbly home. After a few looks, I saw an apple tree. Oh, there's another kind of tree. I rushed up to it, hoping to find an old apple. No apples beneath it. About 40 feet away, however, I found a dried one in the crotch of a tree, stuck there by a squirrel and forgotten. I ate it. It was pretty bad, but nourishing, I hoped. There was another apple tree and 3 walnuts. I scribbled X's. These were wonderful finds. So here, he's starting to make a map. So another thing that scientists do is make models that you guys know. And so he is taking his whole environment, his whole forest environment, and he is creating a map, which is a kind of model, so that he can understand where everything is, and so that he can make notes about where things are and what will be available to him in different seasons, because he's taking the things he knows and then he's putting them with the new information that he's found. So he's being a real scientist in these days that he's spending in the forest. I poked around the foundations, hoping to uncover some old iron implements that I could use. I found nothing. Too many leaves had fallen and turned to loam. Too many plants had grown up and died down over the old home site. I decided to come back when I had made myself a shovel. Whistling and looking for food and shelter, I went up the mountain following the stone walls, discovering many things about my property. I found a marsh. In it were cattails and an arrow leaf, good starchy foods. At high noon, I stepped onto a mountain meadow. An enormous boulder rose up in the center of it. At the top of the meadow was a fringe of white birch. There were maples and oaks to the west and a hemlock forest to the right that pulled me right across the sweet grasses into it. Never, never have I seen such trees. They were giants, old giants. They must have begun when the world began. I started walking around them. I couldn't hear myself step, so dense and damp were the needles. Great boulders covered with ferns and moss stood among them. They looked like pebbles beneath those trees. Standing before the biggest and the oldest and the most king-like of them all, I suddenly had an idea. This next chapter is called, This is About the Old Tree. I knew enough about the Catskill Mountains to know that when the summer came, they were covered with people. Although great-grandfather's farm was somewhat remote, still hikers and campers and hunters and fishermen were sure to wander across it. Therefore, I wanted a house that could not be seen. People would want to take me back where I belonged if they found me. I looked at that tree. Somehow I knew it was home, but I was not quite sure how it was home. Oh, so this old tree is the house that he made. I remember that from the beginning of the story. The limbs were high and not right for a tree house. I could build a bark extension around it, but that would look silly. Slowly I circled the great trunk. Halfway around, the whole plan became perfectly obvious. To the west, between two of the flanges of the tree that spread out to be roots, was a cavity. A cavity means like a hole or a blank space inside. The heart of the tree was rotting away. I scraped at it with my hands. Old, rotten, insect-ridden dust came tumbling out. I dug on and on, using my axe from time to time as my excitement grew. With much of the old rot out, I could crawl in the tree and sit cross-legged. Inside, I felt as cozy as a turtle in its shell. I chopped and chopped until I was hungry and exhausted. I was now in the hard, good wood, and chopping it out was work. I was afraid December would come before I got a hole big enough to lie in, so I sat down to think. You know, those first days, I just never planned right. I had the beginnings of a home, but not a bite to eat. And I had worked so hard that I could hardly move forward to find that bite. Furthermore, it was discouraging to feed that body of mine. It was never satisfied, and gathering food for it took time and got it hungrier. Trying to get a place to rest, it took time and it got it more tired. And I really felt I was going in circles and wondered how primitive man ever had enough time and energy to stop hunting food and start thinking about fire and tools. Okay, so this is a picture that he drew of the trees where he was finding his big old tree that he was going to live in. I left the tree and went across the meadow looking for food. I plunged into the woods beyond, and there I discovered the gorge and the white cascades splashing down the black rocks into the pool below. So this is a waterfall. I was hot and dirty. I scrambled down the rocks and slipped into the pool. It was so cold I yelled. But when I came out on the bank and put on my 2 pairs of trousers and 3 sweaters, which I thought was a better way to carry clothes than in a pack, I tingled and burned and felt coltish. I leapt up the bank, slipped, and my face went down in a patch of dog-tooth violets. You would know them anywhere after a few looks at them at the botanical gardens and in colored flower books. They are little yellow lilies on long, slender stems with oval leaves dappled with gray. Those are what dog-tooth violets are. But that's not all. They have wonderfully tasty bulbs. I was filling my pockets before I got up from my fall. I'll have a salad-type lunch, I said as I moved up the steep sides of the ravine. I discovered that as late as it was in the season, the spring beauties were still blooming in the cool pockets of the woods. They are all right raw, that is if you're hungry as I was. They taste a little like lima beans. I ate these as I went on hunting food, feeling better and better until I worked my way back to the meadow where the dandelions were blooming. So there's dandelions there too. Funny I hadn't noticed them earlier. Their greens are good and so are their roots. A little strong and milky, but you get used to that. A crow flew into the aspen grove without saying a word. The little I knew of crows from following them in Central Park, they always have something to say. But this bird was sneaking, obviously trying to be quiet. Birds are good food. Crow is certainly not the best, but I did not know that then, and I launched out to see where it was going. I had a vague plan to try to noose it. This is the kind of thing I wasted time on in those days, when time was so important. However, this venture turned out all right because I did not have to noose that bird. I stepped into the woods, looked around, could not see the crow, but noticed a big stick nest in a scrabbly pine. I started to climb the tree. Off flew the crow. What made me keep climbing in face of such discouragement, I don't know, but I did, and that noon I had crow eggs and wild salad for lunch. At lunch, I also solved the problem of carving out my tree. After a struggle, I made a fire. Then I sewed a big skunk cabbage leaf into a cup with grass strands. So skunk cabbage is another plant that's there. I had read that you can boil water in a leaf, and ever since then I have been very anxious to see if this was true. It seems impossible, but it works. I boiled the eggs in a leaf. The water keeps the leaf wet, and although the top dries up and burns down to the water level, that's as far as the burning goes. I was pleased to see it work. Then here's what happened. Naturally, all this took a lot of time, and I had not gotten very far on my tree, so I was fretting and stamping out the fire when I stopped with my foot in the air. The fire. Native Americans made dugout canoes with fire. They burned them out, an easier and much faster way of getting results. I would try fire in the tree. If I was very careful, perhaps it would work. I ran into the hemlock forest with a burning stick and got a fire going inside the tree. Thinking that I ought to have a bucket of water in case things got out of hand, I looked desperately around me. The water was far across the meadow and down the ravine. This would never do. I began to think the whole inspiration of a home in the tree was no good. I really did have to live near water for cooking and drinking and comfort. I looked sadly at the magnificent hemlock and was about to put the fire out and desert it when I said something to myself. It must have come out of some book. Hemlocks usually grow around mountain streams and springs. I swirled on my heel. Nothing but boulders around. So here's the good working fireplace with the leaf. So this is a picture right here of him with the leaf bowl and boiling the water and the egg in there. Nothing but boulders around me. But the air was damp somewhere, I said, and I darted around the rocks, peering and looking and sniffing and going into pockets and dales. Wonder what dales are. I'll have to look that word up too. No water. I was coming back, circling wide, when I almost fell in it. 2 sentinel boulders, dripping wet, decorated with flowers, ferns, moss, weeds, everything that loved water, guarded a bathtub-sized spring. You pretty thing, I said, flopped on my stomach and pushed my face into it to drink. I opened my eyes. The water was like glass, and in it were little insects with oars. They rode away from me. Beetles skittered like bullets on the surface, or carried a silver bubble of air with them to the bottom. Ha! Then I saw a crayfish. So we've got beetles and crayfish, and I don't know if he's describing like water striders maybe, those insects with the oars. I'm not sure. I